Thanks everybody for coming, and all of our familiar faces are here. We are going to talk today about comprehension, and that is reading comprehension. And I have with me Claire Mikeson, our English Language Arts Content Specialist here at OPI. And we're going to take you through some of this. If you have any questions, please ask. You know the drill. The feedback form is at the end of the event, and the PDU is linked there in your response from the feedback. And I will let Claire tell you a little bit about herself.
All right. Hi, everybody. I see some familiar faces. My name is Claire Mikeson. I am the ELA Instructional Coordinator at OPI. So sometimes Jackie and my work lines up like this. So I'm really happy to be here with her and have her to fill in those early literacy gaps for me too, because I focused primarily on secondary. This is my 10th year in education. I've been learning a lot about early literacy, but I'm excited to talk today about comprehension because that is one that really flows from those early grades right into secondary, and it's a lot of the same skills. So happy to be here with you all. You're muted, Jackie.
Thank you for joining us. I feel like I know you all well enough. I don't have to reintroduce myself. But we've also got Kim here. You can see Kimberly Evans. She's our data analyst for early literacy. And she usually pushes buttons behind the scenes, but I don't know how to give her the ability to do that since we're on a new platform. That's learning for when we're done. But thanks, Kim, for always coming in to help us out. So since Claire is new to the series, would you please flood the chat? Tell her who you are, what grades and subjects you've taught. The chat should be at the top. Looks like a regular chat icon. Okay, sounds like, oh, there we go, Lockwood. Good. Okay, be as present as you can be. We understand we all have a background. So if there's something you need to take care of, feel free to do it. Participate and answer questions and talk when you can. And of course, if you have something to take care of, go do it. You don't have to have permission to use the lavatory in this class.
All right. So our objectives for today, we're going to talk about reading comprehension and how it is an outcome rather than just a skill. So it's building upon a lot of those other things that Jackie has been talking about in these earlier sessions. She's going to kind of review vocabulary and that content knowledge that is a huge part of comprehension. We'll go over some comprehension strategies, but mostly those will be in context of these 2, 4, and 5 objectives, which is looking at genre and specifically looking at text structures of different genre and organization, and then applying some discussion strategies, both of which are really beneficial in building students' comprehension.
So what is comprehension? Let's read this together. Comprehension refers to the ability to understand and make meaning from what you read, involving both decoding words and understanding the language used, and relies on background knowledge and critical thinking. This is directly from Joan Sedita's work with the Keys to Literacy. And this is also a book recommendation. She has a comprehension routine for preschool through 3rd grade, and then there is a comprehension routine for 4th grade through 12th grade. And well, I highly recommend it. Maybe we won't do a book study on it, but it's worth adding to your library. So the simple view of reading. Remember when Rachel Gott spoke to us and we practiced explaining the simple view? Is there anybody who would volunteer to give that explanation? Just go ahead and unmute.
Decoding plus language comprehension equals reading comprehension?
That's the basics of it. It's a multiplication problem. So we know without one side, we won't have reading comprehension. You can be an excellent decoder and not have language comprehension. So therefore, reading comprehension comes hard, and vice versa. And you'll note here, this is just another graphic of Scarborough's reading rope. Skilled reading is comprehension. We'll let that anchor us as we move on. So Joan Sedita suggests these components for effective comprehension instruction. And they are background knowledge, knowledge of language and text structure, vocabulary, and then comprehension strategies. Another book recommendation, The Knowledge Gap, and that is written by Natalie Wexler. So we look at background knowledge, and that is what you know, what you bring to the learning experience. And we build that with wide reading and rich and diverse learning experiences. Wide reading means many different subjects and genres. It is important that we activate prior knowledge before a learning event and that we connect vocabulary and teach content explicitly so that we are not only building background knowledge, but helping support children in bringing their background knowledge to new learning. One of the things that sticks out to me also from Natalie Wexler is we want to do content before skills, prioritize their understanding, make sure it's relevant, and have discussion about it. So, and just a little background, I was looking at some things the past couple of weeks. In the 2000s, No Child Left Behind and Reading First came our way. And so through that, we added time to the reading block, but we lost time from social studies and science. And it's probably reasonable to say that science and social studies is where a lot of knowledge comes from, in school at least. And so I think it's also reasonable to say that this could be a reason why our informational text scores as a nation
Says this is
have
privately
been so
funded.
low.
Says it's at Newman.
There we go. Got it. So just thinking about that, we've had a dip nationwide in the past 30 years or so in our reading scores. And this is probably one of the factors. And that's also why you see a lot of new curriculum content coming our way that is heavy in science and social studies. So building vocabulary. All of us have 4 types of vocabulary. We have listening vocabulary, speaking vocabulary, reading vocabulary, and writing vocabulary. Most of us regular people aren't strong with all 4 of these, especially when it comes to whatever our content vocabulary is. If we're talking about literacy, I'm probably strong in all 4. but not in all four for any other content. And have you ever paid attention to a kids show, like a cartoon? Kids pick up a ton of vocabulary from watching these, and they will understand a word when it's spoken with them, and in most cases, they can use the word when speaking. If they see a picture of a snake, they can connect the spoken word snake. But it's a whole other thing to be able to read the word and write the word. They have half of the equation until instruction comes into play. Are there any questions about that so far? You can drop them in the chat. So you've probably heard of the 3 tiers of vocabulary by now, but if not, I'll explain it a little bit. Isabel Beck and her friends offer this idea that we have tier 1 vocabulary that is basic. Most kids come to us with a decent tier 1 vocabulary. They're words like sad, eat, baby, etc. Tier 2 vocabulary is where we should be focusing our instruction. We want to pick words that meet the tier 2 definition of high frequency, that's academic vocabulary, and they appear in multiple contexts. But you can see there are words like elderly and foundation and bolt and energy. They're across content, science, social studies, just family words, things like that. Here is that low frequency content specific. You're going to need to know what a molecule is in what class? Science. And aorta and thesis and things like that. As you move on and you get a little bit more interested in what you're learning, you choose school classes in high school, you go to college, you're in a career, that tier 3 vocabulary just becomes your common vocabulary. This is another book I would highly recommend, Bringing Words to Life. And it talks about robust vocabulary instruction. And you'll see a lot of what Craig Busher talked to us about from this author. And so there's no specific formula for placing words into tiers or choosing words for direct instruction, but according to Beck, teachers should consider the following when choosing vocabulary words. How useful is it? Is it a word that students are likely to find in other text? How does the word relate to other words or ideas in our curriculum? Does it relate to a specific topic of study? And what role does the word play in understanding the overall meaning? And I just highlighted the 5 components of effective vocabulary instruction that we learned when Craig spoke to us about this topic. Remember, we embrace complex words. We use them, we teach them. The kids will use them, and it's darling. We want to make vocabulary learning memorable and attach it again to something that the kids can remember. Use pictures. Combine definitional information with contextual information. No longer do we get a list of vocabulary words and look them up in the dictionary to see what they mean. The kids need to learn that in context. And then attend to the sound structure and the meaning, because that connects it all up here in the reading brain. I had a little fun with this, and then Claire and I had some questions, so I did a little bit more learning. So this slide may be a surprise to Claire, or the next one will be. But Stahl in 1999 has a study that says students must be familiar with 95% of the words in a given text to fully understand what they are reading. 95% of the word, that is a lot. Deliberate exposure and wide reading is where they, again, get that background knowledge and build vocabulary. It's also the keys vocabulary, the keys to literacy would say, okay, so keys to literacy has the comprehension routine, but they also have a vocabulary routine. And they talk a lot about preview for difficult words is very important before kids come to them in text. But it's also a great comprehension strategy. So looking at the word vocabulary, I broke this down into syllables. I've marked the vowels. The word vocabulary has the morpheme, everybody, vocab, and that means word. And the suffix, Larry. And this is a suffix that forms nouns meaning relating to. You is a connector. That was the question Claire and I had today. So vocabulary literally translates to something you have that relates to words. I found another word with Larry as the suffix, ovulary. The structure that contains an ovule or ovules in a flowering plant. And so what I could come to is Larry is what you add to something when you can't really specifically name it or count it. So it's just like of a system. That's your vocab lesson for today. It really doesn't have anything to do with comprehension, except for when you do this for your students, this is higher level, of course. But when you do this for your students, you are aiding in their comprehension and future comprehension when they come to words with this as a suffix. They already know part of it. Okay, I will give the mic to Claire.
All right. Yeah, and I would add it's also just an interesting rabbit hole that you can go down yourself if you are a language nerd like Jackie and I. So literacy practices, these are coming out with the new ELA standards, which right now are set to be adopted this next fall and then enacted in 2026. I think they're probably going to move that back, so you don't have to panic too much yet. But these are new, and they're based on the math practices, which have been in the last 2 iterations of math standards. So it's not a brand new thing for Montana standards, but it is new to ELA. And you can see on these that they are kind of just these broad habits, skills, and ways of thinking that are intended to help students develop ways of engaging with text, literature, that might not just be in the classroom. So they're also intended to help with career skills, any sort of reading engagement outside the classroom. And you can see that a lot of these things, you as an early literacy educator or a lot of kindergarten teachers here, these are probably values that you already have and try to implement in your classroom. So they're not too new, and I won't talk about them in detail, but a lot of them relate to the things we are going to talk about or have already talked about. So that broad literacy engagement, we'll talk about the importance of introducing students to different genres to kind of learn those different structures and purposes. We'll talk about discussion, which relates to collaboration, student agency, communication for sure, and critical thinking, of course, we hope applies to a lot of the things that we do in education. So we just wanted to introduce those. We won't really touch back on them, but you can think about how they might connect to what we're talking about or what you're already doing in the classroom. So we'll introduce some of these reading comprehension strategies more in context, but I will just go over some of them with the caveat that these are not going to be useful if students don't already have the vocabulary and background knowledge to access a text. So you definitely want to make sure you're focusing on that before you're introducing these comprehension strategies. But these are ways that if students do have that background knowledge, they can access deeper understanding of a text. So we have self-monitoring, which is developing that metacognition. And you can do this by just modeling your thinking aloud, showing students like, oh, I wasn't paying attention when I read this paragraph. I need to go back and reread, or I don't understand this. Maybe I need to ask a question about this. Visualizing, Graphic organizers can be used in combination with a lot of these other things as a way to help students illustrate concepts. Asking and answering questions, of course, is something that comes up with discussion, and having students do that on their own is going to help develop that critical thinking. Summarizing and text structure are both, they're similar in that they're both looking at organization and categorizing ideas and allowing students to kind of create a hierarchy of information when they read a text so they can understand, okay, this is the main idea. This is something that might be more supportive. And again, recognizing those different genres and purposes. And then predicting is another one that depends heavily on background knowledge, and it's kind of building on those inferential skills that students can have or practice.
I would just add to that because it seems like a good spot. Remember, we've talked about when presented with new knowledge, we need to speak, write, or do something right after so that we can help, we process it. Many of these are opportunities to do just those things. Even better if you speak, write, and do something with your new knowledge.
And we're going to have you speak, write, or do actually a write one for this. So based on those comprehension strategies, it can be helpful to have reminders of them because these are probably things you are already doing in the classroom. But which of these do you know that you do well? For me, I always go back to summary and text structure because I really like thinking about genre and purpose in that context, and especially with my secondary kids. But that one's a strength for me. And then which one would you like to integrate more? So maybe there's one that you're like, oh, I kind of forget about that, or I don't really touch on that one too much. So Jackie's going to go back to that list. Which do you already do well, and which might you want to integrate into your teaching next week or this week? Go ahead and enter it in the chat. Joellen is good at self-monitoring. And Liberty, graphic organizers go really well with text structure too. Jackie's going to show you some.
I always take pause when thinking about self-monitoring and self-regulation with preschool and kindergarten kids because we know.
Lots of prediction generating questions. Being mindful about visualizing what is being read. All right, thank you. So when we're teaching these, research has shown that it doesn't really matter if you spend a ton of time on these as long as you're kind of introducing these. So you don't really need to hammer in these comprehension strategies. It can be useful to just take 20 minutes to teach them and then continue cycling them back in. But there are kind of two strategies that you can use to teach these strategies. We have single strategy integration and multiple strategy integration. And the key with both of them is really explicitly modeling. So like you guys are saying in the chat, demonstrating what it is like to practice that self-monitoring and metacognition. and then have students practice that strategy for a couple weeks and then introduce a new one. With multiple strategies, you're teaching 2 or more at the same time. Both of these are effective. Multiple strategy might be a little bit more authentic just because when students are reading more complex texts on their own, they will have to draw from their own knowledge to decide like, okay, is it helpful in this moment for me to ask myself questions or to go back and reread and to kind of differentiate between those strategies. Does anybody have any questions so far before we switch gears here? All right, we will jump into exploring genre, which is connected with text structure. But this is one way that you can make sure that you're hitting multiple genres, and that can be informational, narrative, digital genres of both texts you can sprinkle in here and there. So and this would be over a 2-week unit, for example. So you'd start with a predictable or a familiar book, and this would be something that might have rhyme, mnemonics, very basic vocabulary. Students might already have it memorized. So it's really accessible to them. And it's kind of refreshing, like, hey, let's think about what you know about this topic. Then you would want to introduce texts that are more narrative, but they're going to add more meaning. So they're going to build students' vocabulary in a specific content area. And then finally, you would add informational texts because those tend to have more complex vocabulary, more complex content knowledge, but students will have spent time in that subject area to be able to kind of build their mental schemas on the topic and access that informational text. And Jackie's going to share some examples of these texts for kindergarten. You're muted, Jackie.
Are you still seeing my screen?
Yes.
Okay, so
see
the
lots of
pictures for some reason are not loading in. You can see the second book, a storybook or narrative nonfiction, I've chosen Planting a Rainbow by Lois Ehlert. The first book was a very simple, sort of repetitive text about my garden. And then the third was a National Geographic book about gardening. It's very much an informational text. So that's sort of what that looks like as you're exploring the genre. You start easy and move to something, you know, most kids need support in reading those National Geographic informational texts. Now I'll go back to presenting. I apologize for that.
And we're going to share a book closer to the end of our session, or part of a book, and it is going to be that middle category, that story where students will have already kind of needed a lower level introduction.
Okay. So we're going to do some breakout rooms. Share with your partner a unit you currently teach, a text you teach in that unit, and the category of the text. Would it be predictable, narrative, or informational? And I'll just do 3 breakout rooms. And we'll go ahead and send you to have a discussion. Is everybody clear on what we're going to discuss? Okay. Mark, it should try to, something will pop up with a white background and it'll send you to a room.
A white background, but nothing in there.
Well, do you want to talk with me? That's what I'm here for.
Well, I get the pro. That's the way you go.
Well, I don't know about that. So think of a book that you read with your daycare kids or your grandkids.
Yeah. So I have one 3-year-old grandson who just loves stories. But of course, what he usually wants me is to go back and read, a story over and over from one day to the next. And so this has given me that idea that yes, and I trying to push him a little harder to go for something that's not familiar so that he can learn something new.
Yeah.
But of course, at first he's kind of begrudging on that, and then we do a new one, and then that becomes his familiar one, and he likes that, and so I'm gradually working him up to more and more, if not at least complex books, at least a different story, so that he learns something new each time.
Right. Yeah.
And so, yeah, that idea of the progression there is very useful.
And you can take, some content from whatever it is he's really interested in. Then you can find a book to bring in that's the next level, but it still has that same content.
Yeah. And I have to keep it simple enough so that, he doesn't get lost, because he's still in the stage of liking to watch pictures too. So you have to keep it simple enough that you can move from one thing to the other without getting bored with all the words and not another picture. But
Yeah.
again, that's a progression too. You need to begin to work him into that.
Mhm.
So,
And it's tough for the little kids to sit for a long story with a lot of language in it.
right.
So if he wants those predictable and easier books, that's where his attention span is at 3 years old. That's pretty normal. Yeah.
Right. And we do a broad section of stuff. I mean, you do everything from, I don't know, the rhyming ones, that are all poetry, to, Grumpy Monkey and those kinds of things, to we do religious Bible stories, and we do those kinds of things. So there's a lot of selection in there that we can pick from to progress in that.
Yeah.
It's fun.
I think he's got a great grandpa.
Well, I try. I don't spend a lot of time with him, but I try. I don't know, of course, at 3 years old. And then I've got an older grandson that's 6 too, and he likes to get into more of the technical and the informational stuff that, he's always asking questions. If I had a penny for every question he asks every day, I'd be a rich man. So
That's how they learn, though. It is.
That is. Yeah, and I love it. It's just sometimes you get a little tired of it, but I really, but I really love it because that's how they learn.
Yeah. I think, let's see, there were 6 in each group, so I'll give a little bit of more time for them to have that discussion. I'm going to look, Mark, just to see what happened here, see if you're unassigned or what's the deal. You don't, for whatever reason, whatever permissions you have on your computer, you cannot join a breakout room in Teams. I will try to look into why that might be happening, see if I can help you for the next one.
Okay, let's see, request control. You'll control content presenter sharing. Nope, don't want to do that. No, don't want to do that.
It may have something to do with certain emails are not considered official.
You know, we have been having some trouble with our regular email account. Microsoft has started blocking our server for some email stuff. I wonder if that could be part of the problem here.
Well, it could be because this is a Microsoft platform.
Right, right.
I'll
We've been
do-
getting emails, but we just can't send anything, so I don't know where that is. We got our provider is looking into it, but I don't
Yeah.
know where that is. I don't know. I don't see anything on here that I see that looks like I could change to make it any better.
Well, we had a good discussion. You got to say all you wanted to say. You didn't even have to take
Yeah.
turns.
I wasn't going to say near as much because everybody else is more of a teacher and they could share, but I got to talk to you. That's pretty good.
We're all here to learn. No one's more important than the other.
Accessibility, hearing sign language captions. Yeah, I just don't see anything that to change anything. So
Yeah. Yep, I'm going to close them and we'll come back and get to it.
you should feel important, Jackie. I'm a farmer and I just pulled the tractor into the backyard and came in. So
You're very
Sorry.
important.
And
I hope nobody got cut off.
we got
We are at 20 minutes left, so we're going to keep going. And anybody who wants to stay when we're finished, if you wanted to discuss something that happened in the breakout room, we sure can. So narrative structure. Again, teaching children the structure of a type of text is a comprehension strategy. There are many templates in the Google folder for your use, and I found them for free on the internet. You, of course, can make your own, but also, of course, it's not coming through. Can you see the pictures on this slide? It says the 5 W's. Okay. So the 5 W's is a framework that I used with kindergarten and first graders, and it really complemented teaching the WH sounds and phonics. And these are common questions used that they're question words that kids understand. So there's much more you can do with who, what, when, where, and why than just answer text questions. But so we teach elements of narrative structure using a list of elements, a story map, a graphic organizer, a sequencing activity. Common things in a narrative are a plot, characters, setting, a problem and a conflict, and themes. Younger students can respond to simpler cues like who, what, when, where, why, what happened. And you can see there's 2 levels of graphic organizers here, and I'm sure there are multi-levels that you could find. Even in preschool, if you wanted children to respond to text that you just read, you can help them fill out the 5 W's. So some other things to think about that is common in narrative text. I won't read the list. Metaphor and similes, these scare me because I am not an English language arts teacher. I'm a reading teacher. But onomatopoeia is really fun no matter how old you are. But you often see dialogue, conjunctions, story elements, all of those things you're going to see in books that you're reading with early literacy age children. And we see a lot of allegory as well, and that's usually in the form of a fable. But I want to say we're probably not explicitly teaching too many of these until 2nd or 3rd grade, but the vocabulary and the language and concepts in our read aloud stay with the kids. And then they have the background knowledge when they do learn more deeply into these concepts. So what we do now has huge instructional utility later when it comes to different genres. So graphic organizers. I'm one of those people that like to use the same one all the time so that the kids knew how to use it. This is what we're doing. You do not have to be that rigid, but type A, which is not very much of me, but type A teacher me really wanted to have it always the same. This is where you find it. Pull one out, get a copy. Let's go. And every one of you knows why. But so this is their opportunity to plan, write, or do. Speak, write, or do. They can tell their own stories. This helps them map out what they want to say, as well as to be a response to what they've heard or read. Storyboards can vary in complexity, and that's just depends on what your children's fluency or abilities are at that time. And having students retell stories and identify elements. I'm sure if you're all using a core curriculum, you're talking about characters, plot, and setting. But they give ways to focus on the structure. And remember, it's a response to what they're doing now, and it's experience that they carry with them for what they're going to do later with this stuff that we're discussing. And now Claire.
Yeah, and a lot of those things, I kind of touch on it more maybe in the next slide, but it's a good segue from Jackie's slide. But a lot of those things, they still like same ideas of working on those skills. And like I used Venn diagrams frequently for secondary kids. And I always thought like, oh, it's too easy, but they can get really into depth with it. So a lot of those strategies for looking at text structure, you can just build on them as they get older and the text becomes more complex. So their thinking has to become a little bit more nuanced, but it really does kind of go from one grade to another as students get older. So informational structure, you can use some of this focus on language as a way to teach structure as well. These are some common structures or patterns that you'll see in informational text. And we have description, which is not just in informational text. And it is also worth noting that the new ELA standards are actually going to be combining informational and literary standards. And then that's kind of to reflect this idea that when students are reading any text, they're reading it with a specific purpose in mind. And there's also not, that's kind of a false dichotomy of just we have our informational and we have our narrative, because genre can be a little bit more complex than that. And these strategies can really overlap or really vary from text to text, even in the same genre. But looking at these common structural patterns in informational text, we also have sequencing, and using that language like first, later, finally, can be a way for them to recognize what that pattern looks like. Problem and solution, cause and effect, that compare and contrast, again, pairing these with those graphic organizers, Venn diagrams, we all know are great for compare and contrast. So oftentimes you can kind of combine these strategies to provide that both visual and maybe if students are talking about these as well. Yeah, I'm ready for the next one. Thanks, Jackie. So with text structure, these are some common strategies that you can use, and you can scaffold these for using with the whole class during read alouds before students are even reading on their own. So this idea of predicting, a lot of you said, describing what happens, or even describing a picture, because that idea of comprehension can be applied to different media formats too. Summary and categories we talked about are this idea of coming up with different hierarchies or information, ways to sort information. So categorizing, you can ask students just verbally, like, what kind of different clothes do we wear? What are different breakfast foods? Liberty was talking about her unit on insects. So you could ask students, what are the different kind of insects? And just explicitly say, like, we're categorizing, we're learning this strategy or this structure. Yeah. Any questions on those narrative or informational structures before we move on to discussion? All right, I'll jump right in. So discussion. This is another one that is super beneficial. So looking at text structure, looking at discussion, these are both things that should be done in conjunction with those comprehension strategies. And discussion has really high efficacy for teaching students comprehension or improving students' comprehension. So you can often structure discussion to complement the text that you're reading. So the text you're selecting might be based on the content standards you want to emphasize, or vice versa. You might be introducing a text and it might really align well with a certain grade level and ability and content standards. So these three categories, locate and recall, integrate and interpret, and critique and evaluate, these are broken down to summarize the question types that are included on the NAEP assessment, that national assessment for 4th and 8th graders. And you might also notice that they really align well with different levels of thought. So like Bloom's taxonomy, where we have that bottom level of understanding where can students just recall information? And then we get up to critique and evaluate. So they're assessing, they're making judgments, and these can align well with genres that students are doing too. So you can incorporate those critique and evaluate if you are having students write an argument or an opinion piece, for example, in those, probably not kindergarten, but in those later grades. And then they're still thinking of, in kindergarten, how do we verbalize our arguments or our opinions? You can also integrate inferential questions. And inference is something we do naturally as humans because it's very based on background knowledge. But in order for students to make inferences, they again have to have that vocabulary and the understanding of a text in order to really dig deeper into a text. But questions that will promote inferential thinking are asking for more details about a text and making generalizations. So they are reading a text and connecting it to something else they learned about or something else that they know or have noticed about the world. And here are just some questions that you can, question stems that you can use, that you can have students practice to move from that idea of just identification to really dig into the meaning of a text and develop comprehension. So why did you think this about the text? If you were the author, what does this word remind you of and why? And Jackie will talk about on the last slide how you can scaffold having those conversations as a class to maybe having students use those questions in pairs. We're going to just do a quick flood the chat. Well, I guess it's not that quick, but I'll talk about this question, the author strategy, and then read a short excerpt of a book and you will write a question the author question. So as teachers, a lot of you already mentioned, like, I'm really great at asking questions of my students based on a text during read aloud, which is exactly what this strategy is. But you're specifically targeting what the author's choices or motivations were in writing, and getting students to understand those rhetorical choices, making the text more transparent, thinking from that writing perspective. So you might ask about a story you're reading. What is the author's message here? Why did the author choose this word? How would it have been different if the author used this word? Why do you think the author is telling this now? How does this event connect with what we learned earlier? So questions like that. So we'll come back to this slide as you think of an example, but I will read you this story excerpt next. And I studied abroad in India. I did my student teaching there. And Sartak Sinha was an art teacher at the school that I was at. And now he is, so he's always done art, but he also has this beautiful children's book. So I thought it was a great one to share for this session. So I'll read it and then we can cycle back through it. But you're thinking of a question you would ask the students about the author's choice. Farah loves mangoes. She could eat them all day long without getting tired. And she wouldn't mind living in one either. She could go swimming in an ocean full of them. In fact, she even reads them stories from the book Grandpa gave her, before eating them, obviously. All these mangoes come from Grandpa's mango tree. It is even older than Grandpa. Every year, it always has mangoes, which they collect with Molly.
So we want to practice the strategy, come up with a question based on the excerpt, and I'll go back to the questions so that you can see them. Or you might have one of your own.
And I'll write an example one in there. Jackie and I thought of our own questions this morning. We were like, what would we ask if we were reading this?
And unrelated, but did you catch the metaphor?
Jackie, do you want to, would it be helpful to cycle through this story one more time?
Sure.
Ooh, why is the author telling us about Molly? Why talk about mangoes? Yeah, and Jackie mentioned earlier, this would, or I guess when we were talking, this would be one that you might need to teach students what a mango is. And bring mangoes for a snack, which a lot of people in my breakout room talked about, not only the text they teach, but then the activities that they did with it. So that was fun.
Mm-hmm. And is there a crayon in your box that looks like you could call it mango?
Ooh, what might the author want us to wonder about? That's a great question. Oh yeah, Susan, I had that same one.
Ocean full of them. I feel like that's metaphor.
Yeah.
Ah, there it is. The grandparent and the dog. Those are as important to Farah as mangoes. probably.
Yeah, why does the author introduce the grandpa?
You're definitely talking about the word obviously.
I
Ooh,
like
is a
that. Does the
mangle
author expect us to believe this story is true too? Because
Yeah.
this would be a good introduction to that non-literal language.
Anyway, good work, good thinking. We're quickly running out of time, so let's talk about discussion quickly. Remember, we want to model. We want to model thinking, what we might ask ourselves when we're reading a text. And then you want to scaffold up. You'll have kids that will be at various places in their ability to have a collaborative discussion. You can assign roles. Maybe this is for older students, but when it's time to discuss at your table group, what is your role? Are you going to ask the questions? Are you going to keep your classmates on task? Are you going to take notes? Will you be the speaker when we talk about what you talked about? You can share predictions and summaries in pairs. So if kids are always paired up, remember it could be Mickey and Minnie or Never Johnny and Susie, or that kind of thing. But if they always have a pair to have a discussion with, everybody gets to have that discussion at the same time. They do not have to wait a turn. You're not wasting instructional time. And everybody gets the chance to speak as well, right? Because you're not going to go through 15 kids. But if they each talk to their neighbor, it takes 1 minute. You can have students generate questions for the discussion. Writing in a reflection journal. So maybe it's a reflection journal, or maybe it's just the sheet that comes out of the workbook next in your ELA program. That is still journaling. That is say, do, write, right? Opportunities to reflect on what just happened. Discussion chips. That's kind of fun. You probably really need those with second and third graders, especially if they're going to have a discussion group of 4 to 6. And you can have them respond to a discussion by just using stickers or making a smiley face, how that made them feel. And then here we go. So Hugh Katz is a leading researcher and scientist in the science of reading, and he's with the University of Florida. And he made this statement at a conference where Claire and I were both attending, and it resonated with both of us because that's the first thing we wanted to put in our slideshow. Comprehension is not a skill. It is a condition that you create. When you do all of the things for the decoding side, and you do all of the things to build the language side, the result is comprehension. So yes, you're going to teach comprehension strategies. Yes, you're going to teach vocabulary and background knowledge, but that really all goes into handling language comprehension. And that paired with decoding, remember, is how we get skilled reading.